A few years ago, Christian Henson put out a video discussing piano samples. And one thing he talked about in it that had never really occurred to me at the time was the fact that because there is a mechanical delay between the pressing of the key and the striking of the hammer on the strings, a piano player tends to rush their parts to compensate for the mechanical delay of the piano. And to that point, if you made a piano where the hammer strike is the beginning of the sample when you play it, then the pianists are going to end up rushing all of the parts, and the whole thing may end up out of time as a result. And so that's why he likes to keep the mechanical delay in his samples. The thing about samples is that you're trying to capture something that is a natural experience. Samples are trying to make something perfect out of something that's not. And that's where you end up with the real challenge. At the end of the day, I began to realize, like Christian had, that the imperfections in the samples are part of what gives them the natural character that makes it feel like playing the instrument, or at least gives you the satisfaction that you get from the live instrument. A few years back, when I was making a couple of my earliest sample libraries, I had recorded a gong, a mixing bowl, and some low toms, and in all of them, I noticed something as I began to hit it harder. The thing I would notice in the samples when I began editing them was that there's this long, dipping bow that will end up happening right before the transient. At first, I decided to include that part in the sample. The thing is, it created enough of a significant delay in the sample after it was played that it felt really unnatural. And I realized, though I still have no idea what's causing it, that it must be some kind of phenomenon that's either caused in the microphone or in the instrument itself right before you play it. And so I began having to cut it. The problem is that it doesn't always line up perfectly. In many cases, it ends up making my zero crossing very far away or very abrupt. And so I end up having to fade off the ends. The other problem I began to realize when I was working with some of this stuff, as I was editing in Reaper, Pro Tools, and Logic and seeing how each of them interacted, each of them seems to recognize the transient as being in a different place when I try to do it using any kind of beat detection. The thing also is that in the same way that a piano player has learned to compensate for the mechanical delay of their instrument, another thing to be mindful of is that in recording there are also these kinds of delays, not in the performance, but in the placement of the mics. And a big place that comes through is in drums. You'll notice if you play, for example, this tom drum, all of these other mics come in at a later place. Now, if you're editing using a beat detector, or if you're just kind of trying to get the perfect gridded sound, get the samples to feel as clean and consistent as possible, you may have the instinct to cut all of these at the transient and line them up and phase correct them. The thing is, though, the sound that we're used to, especially in a natural performance, any drum recording we're used to listening to, naturally feels as big as it does because of the delay between that close mic and the room mics or the overheads. And so when I'm editing drums, I always edit to the earliest mic first and leave all the other samples delayed as they are naturally to that first hit. And I tend to find, overall, that you get a much more natural room sound out of that. Now, right now, I'm working on a small little tongue drum library, just a big one, a little one, that I recorded this week, and I've been editing it and had to put out a video, so I figured this would be a perfect time to talk about my editing process. It's all pretty straightforward. You can see on the screen I have it very zoomed in. I tend to find the transient area that I want to cut for any mic, and I tend to slice it as closely as I can to that point, giving a little bit of space because I'm usually going to have to fade in at the beginning, as you can see on the already cut one beneath. The one above is actually just the same one as beneath, but with the beginning part dragged out a little bit to show you that in the tongue drum I've experienced a similar phenomenon to what I had experienced with the tom drums, and that is that I have this sort of hoop happening before the actual transient. And in this case, I'm cutting that hoop out. It's not audibly doing much. I think it may possibly just be a puff of air hitting the microphone from the mallet as I go in to strike the drum, possibly. But it doesn't always line up. The other thing, of course, with the tongue drum is that the tongue drum is one instrument. All of the notes are very sympathetic to each other. When you're striking one note on the instrument, you're not just hearing that note, but you're also hearing the sympathetic frequencies of other notes in the series, as well as when you strike it hard enough, other notes that may be dissonant that are ringing out purely from the force of the strike. The thing is that the character of the tongue drum tends to really come from all the frequencies adding up. And that does give it a little bit of an unpleasantness sometimes, but that is part of what makes the tongue drum sound like it does. And so you'll notice if you look at the tail leading up to this particular strike, it hasn't completely faded out. Now, when I edit these, I fade the back end and I cut it close enough to the transient that it's not going to fade in or out awkwardly at the beginning or end of the sample. But one thing that I did want to keep and preserve in the striking of these drums was that I wanted to still have that tiny bit of motion happening. Generally, I don't want that. If I'm doing drums, for example, it may be 50-50. With some other instruments, I actually want to isolate the notes a little bit more. But with the tongue drum all being one thing, all sympathetic to itself, I'm trying to preserve a little bit of that natural stacking of harmonic detail. And that's not the only thing to keep in mind when you're sampling an instrument. Sometimes different techniques or even just different small details can change the character just enough or just slightly to give you a little bit of variant. Another example I have down here now on the notes on the smaller of the tongue drums is the difference in my left and right hand articulation. Currently, you're looking at a sample from the right hand. You'll notice that it's a very clean, almost kind of cone shape. It's very, very even decay, very straightforward. And you'll notice for the most part, you're going to get a lot of that. Maybe there's a little bit of stutter in that very initial transient, but for the most part, you're getting pretty clean lines. Now we come over here, this is the first of the left hand set. You'll notice very quickly that the transient is a bit more squared off, and you might also notice a little bit more waving happening afterwards. My left hand was at a different angle and not quite as accurate as the right hand, and so you'll notice with these left hand samples that you have a slightly different shape and a slightly different character. Noticing here how much it waves off at the end, and you end up actually kind of having a slight FM effect where you have different frequencies almost modulating each other, which is part of what you get with something like a tongue drum in some ways. That's why FM is so popular for trying to get those kind of metal sounds. And finally, another reason I like to edit by hand, aside the fact that it gives me the chance to choose how I kind of voice my samples and what natural phenomenon to keep or leave out that's not going to be necessarily caught by an algorithm, is that I tend to like to make very dynamic samples. And in this case, with these samples, there are places where I am playing on the very, very edge of silence. And if you look at this one, you can see it is very, very, very quiet. Even zoomed in like this, you can barely see where the transient starts. And it is audible, but it is barely audible. And that's kind of the trick that I'm trying to get, is that very, very, very gentle, almost feeling of a note, as well as some very loud strikes. And I tend to find even the more accurate engines might miss the transient on something like this completely, especially since, again, I'm letting the previous notes ring out enough that with some of these transients, they are only barely more than the tail as it fades out otherwise, and so it could be easily missed. And I find this gives me the chance to more accurately voice all of my samples. At the end of the day, my mission in making samples is to preserve as much of the natural feeling of the instrument as possible. I want the dynamics, I want the imperfections, I want what the left and right hand do differently to be part of the instrument. I want those little imperfections. The only time I leave samples out, generally, is when it's bad enough that there is a clear misfiring. For example, when I've struck something on the tongue drum and you hear a bit too much of the stick of the mallet, or if there's a kind of buzz or rattle from the mallet bouncing off of the note and not striking it cleanly. But otherwise, I like to preserve that variation in the notes. And so at the end of the day, it may take longer, but I feel like the results I get preserve my vision more accurately. And at the end of the day, when I'm making samples for True North Audio or even for a client, my mission is to make something that best represents the source material. So in doing this, I think it's important to remember to embrace imperfection and to embrace the little details in performance or recording that make an instrument not always feel as mechanically perfect as you might want it to feel when you're trying to make samples like these. Be mindful of how they're played. Be mindful of the techniques used by the people who play these instruments. Sometimes, even be mindful of techniques you can use that are wrong both for the sample and for the performance of the instrument that may still enhance the player experience. And be mindful of the room. Be mindful of the fact that delay in the signal is part of what causes it to feel more natural. In the same way that in a binaural headset, for example, the delay between the left and right ear is a big part of why it sounds three-dimensional to us. If you were to take a sample recorded on a binaural headset and line up the left and right ears so that they're more perfectly in time, you're going to lose that three-dimensional effect. It will still be in stereo. You will still have two different sounding samples, but you're not going to have the time that gives it that space to feel truly dimensional. So this has been Kiko with True North Audio. Thank you for joining me on this short little video on my philosophy for editing samples, and keep your eye out for the tongue drum that should be coming here in the next few days. Until next time.